Hello there and welcome to The Value of Everything. So I apologise for this one. This is a very long time in the making. Michael Acuña and I recorded this about 2 debates into the election. So I think this timeline is around about after the 9th of October and prior to the 19th, 2016. Now, before you think this is all old news, you're going to have a repetitive commentary on past events. Michael and I do cover a lot of subjects as to the Trump presidency in general, and we go into a certain amount of depth in regards to Trump's character as well. So there's a lot of analysis and predictions which is still relevant to this day, which is worthy of listening into to see what comes true. So now let me hand you over. All right. Okay, so is there any areas of focus which is happening in the news or anything like that at the moment that you'd like to give me some of your thoughts on?
Well, I think that probably the big story right now is events surrounding the presidential election here in the United States. It appears that the political establishment has been trying to pull out all the punches, as it were, against Trump as things near the November election time, and it's getting really it's getting out of hand, it seems.
Yeah, I mean, it's the way I'm seeing it at the moment is that Donald Trump isn't necessarily a total hero, because there's certain little things that I see the way that he talks. There's a tiny little essence of, I don't know if this is the right word, arrogance or you're wrong and things like that, which I hear him like he's starting to sound a little bit repetitive to me. It might be just my subjective position, but that's the way that I see him in his debates. The very first debate and the other debate, he just seems to be continuing on this phase. And when somebody's got a little bit more liveness to them, he seemed to be losing that a little bit. But I think he obviously is trying to hit the core of her arguments, and they're not really they're not really interlocking at all when they're having any of their arguments anyway. So it's interesting, but that from that perspective. So I wouldn't say that that Trump is a complete hero in this situation at the moment. But then the media onslaught is unbelievable. You're getting a lot of information. Well, would you say that there is a bit more of a balance of stories, really? It isn't necessarily all from Trump's side.
No, you're right. And I do agree that Trump is, at least in my estimation, egomaniacal, narcissistic kind of individual. I've always thought this about him, and I agree that he is repetitive, and I've been following the debates closely, and I actually disagree with a lot of the pundits in terms of who's winning these debates. I think that even though Trump loses when it comes to substantive policy proposals, I honestly don't think he's that much of a policy wonk, as they say. He has succeeded in at least rattling Clinton to the point where she doesn't know what to do often in response, and also in trying to deflect attention away from some of these scandals that have come out recently. The fact that he's able to sort of overcome those and still be a political entity is pretty meaningful. I don't think a lot of other politicians would have been able to get away with that. But there definitely is a bias in how people are reporting around this, especially with the recent revelations ongoing with WikiLeaks and Hillary Clinton's campaign. It seems like all of those really important stories are buried underneath all of this trivial nonsense they bring up about Trump. I mean, I'm not trying to minimize what Trump has done, all of his scandals. And I don't think that he's a hero by any means. I just think that the political establishment is really keen on having Clinton get in as opposed to Trump. They just don't know what to make of him, honestly.
what's that term that everyone likes to throw in there about this? Is it cultural Marxism? They claim that this the reason why everyone's so shocked about what's happening with Trump is because of the conditioning that we have, and it's telling us that we should be all shocked and aghast by the fact that somebody is being, well, I'm not trying to minimize it, but it's like macho bravado and things like that. Let's say the phrase is, I grab her pussies and they're all over me and stuff like that. Now, let me try and be perfectly honest. I've heard stories where mates have spoken to me after nights out and things like that, and that kind of language has been used before. It's not totally out of the realms of possibility. The way he says it is a little bit uncouth, I would imagine, but it's, I don't know. Where do you stand on that? The actual terms here, where he was talking, just like if it was man-to-man kind of conversation and things like that.
Right. Well,
I know it wasn't meant to be in the public domain. Obviously, we know that.
Right. Yeah. It was a hot mic situation. When it comes to cultural Marxism, I've always disagreed with that as a label as making any sense. I know why some people employ it in this context. I do agree that political correctness is a legitimate phenomena. I just don't think it has anything to do with Marxism, but other people like to ascribe it to Marxism. But that does bear on the sort of speech codes and hypersensitivity that's been in our cultural atmosphere the last decade or two. I think that it's obvious that Trump was just, engaging in the sort of hyperbolic, macho bullshit that guys, a lot of guys do this. It's not out of the ordinary. I don't think he was speaking literally. I can't say for sure. I mean, maybe he did. Maybe he was overly aggressive with women to the point where it would be a problem. But I'm inclined to think that it was just him. He was sort of one-upping this Billy Bush character. Guys do that kind of shit all the time. It's not. It's nothing that should be that outrageous. But I can see how, given the timing and how it was phrased. And also, I don't think Trump adequately acknowledged it. He sort of dismissed it as quote unquote locker room talk, which is fine, but I think you have to be a little more clear in defending yourself. He should have been like, these were figurative statements. I didn't mean.
He could have explained them.
The
only problem with doing that is that you start to you're going to open yourself to more questions afterwards, and you're better off just shutting down the story and apologizing rather than, maybe this is what his strategy was: shut down the story, apologize, rather than trying to explain your way out of the situation. Maybe you dig yourself a little bit further, maybe, but I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, he did definitely, at least during the debate, he succeeded in getting past that. When I first started watching, and I was thinking that could have been the end of his entire campaign right then and there if they had attacked it ferociously enough, which it seemed like they were on the verge of doing.
Yeah.
But he also started. He seemed to fumble a little bit when they brought it up. He kept trying to segue into ISIS and all these irrelevant.
Yeah, I noticed he was like, the thing is, like, I don't know who was his advisor. He with Hillary, there's a lot of conversions. So like when she puts forward one argument, you can use that argument and twist it back on them very easily. But he just wasn't even doing that. It just was like, it's like a different subject almost. It's like I couldn't even see where they were engaging each other a lot of times.
Right.
And that's where I thought, maybe like even Donald Trump is showing a lot of weaknesses in the terms of, like, I don't know, just like an old man who can rant is kind of a novel thing to see, and you can see like he's like, I don't know, appealing to the young man and things like that. But then there's just a little bit of there's not enough plasticity to the way that he can maneuver sometimes. and
I
that
agree.
may be a little bit of his problem.
When it comes to his rhetoric in these sort of engagements, he seems to stick to a couple of talking points. It's hard for him
Yeah,
to.
yeah,
I don't know if it's deliberate or if he just is incapable of really elaborating on his points, so he sort of repeats himself. So he'll say things like, "We're gonna knock the hell out of ISIS. We're gonna win in trade deals." Etc. Etc. It's sort of like these boilerplate talking points as opposed to like a substantive thought on the matter.
yeah,
And that works with voters. I see how it's got him this far. I just think that when it comes to debates, it can be a drawback because people can draw attention to that and try to make you look weak if you can't defend your position.
yeah. I mean, I think the only thing I can really put it down to, I mean, even though the man says he doesn't suffer from it, but I think it's probably nerves. I think, like,
Could be.
yeah, nerves can make you very repetitive, and nerves can make you sound not quite yourself and things like that. So he's a little bit more fluid, definitely, when he's like doing the interviews and stuff. And obviously
Sure.
he's been quite exposed. Well, his family's been exposed, his relationships. I'm sure he wouldn't really want to expose that side of him to Melania and things like that. So that's
Oh
probably
yeah,
opened up a whole can of worms for him behind closed doors. So,
I'm sure it has. Yeah.
so
And I shudder to think what they're going to bring out in the next couple of weeks because the election is nearing, and on both sides there's going to be quite a few things that they try to bring out of sheer desperation.
yeah,
Because all things considered, I think Hillary is ahead in the polls, but Trump is doing better than I think anyone else would be doing given all of these scandals and what's happened. Um, so they're still pretty concerned. Honestly, if I had to predict, as I've been doing throughout our discussions, I still think Hillary Clinton is going to win the election, but I don't think she's going to win by a large margin.
yeah. And that's going to annoy a lot of people, I'd imagine.
I think so, yeah.
So, yeah, in terms of the election, I know we've did the whole subject of conspiracy theory beforehand, but this news article keeps on flashing up, and I keep on seeing it, and I don't know why it's grabbing my attention. But have you heard of that? I can't remember if its name is Coulson. I think that's the Formula One guy. It was something else, something Steen or something, where he was a billionaire, basically paedophile, and he had a
Oh,
Caribbean
uh,
island.
yeah,
And
Jeffrey Epstein.
Epstein, there you go.
Yeah.
And his name is coming around in these like dodgy, probably news articles I shouldn't really be reading, and it's being associated with Bill Clinton as well as Donald Trump as well. It's really weird. I don't know why I'm keep on seeing this thing, but you know
Yeah.
the ultimate way of trashing a person that I always find is very clear, and it seems to be bloody paedophilia is pretty much throughout politics, entertainment, everything like that. But the way that you can destroy somebody is to say, right, paedophilia is there. That's that person. He's got that. We've got these pictures with these people here, and like, boom, it's
Yeah.
game over for you. There's nothing worse that you can do that. You'd probably be better off being a murderer than being a paedophile in some respects.
Yeah, it's true. I mean, that's sort of like a universal cultural taboo. So if you should be accused of something like that, it's probably the worst thing someone could accuse you of in terms of your character. I looked into the Jeffrey Epstein ordeal a long time ago when all of that had initially broke out. They had these terms like Bill Clinton would go to his island on the quote unquote Lolita Express, and
Yeah,
I think that the evidence clearly points out. I don't know if it's clear that Clinton and some of the other people that would go there engaged in like lewd acts with minors or anything, but I think it's clear that Epstein did. I think that there's more than enough evidence pointing in that direction. I don't think that it was only minors that were in this bizarre sexual scandal.
Yeah.
But I know that there were minors involved, and I know that Epstein was instrumental in that. Now, as to whether or not Trump personally did this, I don't think so. I don't think he has a history of that sort of thing. But I'm sure he knew Epstein. It's a pretty small circle when it comes to these multi-millionaire, billionaire, and political elites, and they all know each other loosely. They've all associated with one another at some point. So I'm sure he's met Epstein. He may have gone out there. He may have done a few personal engagements. But if they try to associate him with those sort of criminal acts, I think they'd be leaving the Clinton campaign open to the same vulnerability because of Bill Clinton's closer association with Epstein.
Yeah, I mean, this is going a few steps ahead, but even so, Donald Trump, right? Imagine if you could spin it around the other way. Donald Trump has literally accused an ex-president of being a rapist, a serial rapist, right? and it's not even. It's like it doesn't even seem to be in the news. I checked it on the news the other day, and it was just like I even was just interested to see like a picture of Bill Clinton's face when he was just mentioning all of this, because that must have been a face to see. But nothing. Just literally, it was like maybe obviously some bits, but we're going way into the alternative media to find any information on this. There's just literally no major media or journalist who wants to pick this up.
Yeah, I think Roger Stone has been the one that's really been pushing the rape narrative, and there are, one or two women that have accused Bill Clinton of sexual assault. I think Juanita Broderick is probably the one that has gone the furthest in that direction. The mainstream media is finally, in the United States anyway, they're finally sort of getting around to addressing it, but it's always dismissive, which is ironic because Hillary Clinton has always been such a staunch advocate of women victims of sexual abuse, how we always have to defer to their emotions and always assume that they're being honest. But when it comes to these particular women, no one's really entertaining these ideas as having any basis in reality. The mainstream media, when they bring up, say, Juanita Broderick, they claim that her story has changed so many times that her credibility just isn't there. And I don't know. I've never really looked that far into the specific claims, and one way or another, it's exceedingly difficult to prove these things.
Yeah.
Especially when they've happened decades ago, as in the case with Bill Clinton. But just the fact that no one's talking about it is revealing to me.
Would you say that America's got a free press? Because at some point and some balance, they can investigate any situation. They can investigate the news, like investigate a person. But then there's a point in which that goes too far, and they can get sued for libel and all these repercussions which can occur. So it's a mess. It's not really anything. And say, for example, if we start to put out things about Donald Trump and we make all these false accusations about Donald Trump, then he's got the power, he's got the billions to say, all right then, if you want to go down that route, let's take you to court and I'm going to just rinse you dry. So it's how would you take that one? Is it, there's some, with capitalism, you can never really have true freedom of the press or even fairness in court?
Yeah, I think strictly speaking, in the United States anyway, we do have a free press, but and I think there's a lot of empirical evidence to this effect that Noam Chomsky did a lot of research in his propaganda model, where even though, you know, in principle, the media can write on any subject they'd like. And you brought up libel laws, which ironically Trump wants to make even stricter, which is a big issue in my opinion.
Right.
But nevertheless, within those parameters set by libel laws, in principle, the media can report on anything they want. Now, since we have a largely corporate media, you have to take into account the interests of the advertisers and also the incestuous ties between journalists, editors, and the political establishment.
You're never going to get anybody writing anti-corporation news articles.
No, not at all. And when it comes to like foreign policy, you're going to see extreme biases in how they report this. So I guess the way to phrase it is we have a free press in the strictly legal sense of the term, but in practice, they're, functioning within the parameters set by the economic and political establishment. Now, on the margins, we have the independent press. And as I think I said last time, they can be just as biased and wrong as the corporate media, just in another way. But at least we have those options.
Yeah.
But yeah, I don't trust anything that. Well, I shouldn't say I don't trust anything, but I treat skeptically most of the political, foreign policy, and economic publications that I see.
Just interesting. I just want to take if you could just like strip down Donald Trump, how would you break it down? Because I'll just quickly summarize him for me. Like, he's good that he's bashing the media. It's good that he's bashing to a certain degree. He went against the Fed recently a little bit. He's bashed against all the crony capitalism and how public funders do this kind of stuff. I know he sounds like a hypocrite when he does this because he's done it before in the past, but at least he's speaking out, and that's really sort of connecting with the people, and he's highlighting a lot of the issues which are occurring in America. He's making the mainstream like the situation of the economy, whereas Democrats would have gone all through this going, oh, everything's fine, we're going to do better than next year and all these kind of things. He's made some very good, let's say, technical, military or strategic choices whereby he will start to say, look, we got problems with NATO not being like, it's an archaic thing. It's not really been used for terrorism. He's described how certain wars he was never against. There was no point in dethroning Colonel Gaddafi and creating the rise of ISIS. And so he'll make all these little points, and I think a lot of them are fairly well grounded in the whole grand scheme of things. He'll say things like, which is totally, really never really heard from any president, that he would like to get on with Putin. So all these little things are sort of ticks in terms of where I would see a president and how the people perceive him. But then there's the dark side, and this gets overshadowed by a lot of, like, say, the Trump supporters, and I don't think many people mention this, but this is really which is key, because everyone's going to see, like, your candidate, you're going to be always seeing them for the brightest sides. You're always going to be looking at the best aspects of every candidate, but it's very hard when you're siding for that person to see the shadows, really. And the main shadows that I see with Donald Trump is obviously there is the egotistical side. So there's going to be this ultimate grab for power. So I could see that he would love power. So the more power to him, the more choices that he can put down for law and make it sound and things like that. I know that there's the political system in America stops that to a certain degree with the Senate and the vote and things like that. But even so, I can see him saying this is going to be a bit more of an autocratic sort of presidency with me coming into power. There's the problems that I have with him with terms of he can be, well, this is a good thing and bad thing. He can be politically incorrect, and sometimes it's probably best to just say the things that keep everything fairly peaceful, because he's got a lot of explaining to do with, like, say, the statesmen in Mexico and the statesmen in China, unless it's definitely going to go in some certain direction. So that's going to be a little bit choppy for him as well. But in some say, in that respect, there sometimes he could say in a counter argument, well, this gives me more of a negotiating position. Whereas if I was all la-di-da and everything's fantastic, maybe that's not quite the same. But I could see him also encroaching on just human liberties as well. So when it comes to police watching you, police searching you, police scanning the internet, things like that, I can definitely see that all raise the ante on. So these are the real dirty, dark secrets of where you could see that candidate coming from, and in essence that, like, you can get people that can wreck economies and things like that, and do all these kind of things. But the power grab is the most dangerous thing. I don't know if you agree with me on this thing, but as soon as you take the absolute power situation and then you start watching them, the Orwellian sort of route, which unfortunately Donald Trump does tick a lot of boxes in that respect, then there's a problem there.
Yeah, I think that I agree with your analysis. I part ways just a little bit. I agree that on balance, Trump's campaign and this whole populist resurgence that we're seeing more broadly is on balance probably a beneficial thing. It's causing people to re-examine the status quo and some of its ideological justifications. Trump has opened up questions that have just been off the agenda for a long time. When it comes to his positive attributes, I agree with you. His foreign policy seems to be more defensible and logical than Hillary Clinton's continued interventionist policy. I think that the issue of trade and of combating the more radical Wahhabist sects in the Middle East that are causing us issues in terms of national security is important. But those negative qualities are certainly there. Where I sort of take a different approach would be on the issue of whether or not Trump is interested in absolute power in the authoritarian sense. I think that Trump is a very vain individual, and he's not particularly ideological, which is a problem because he doesn't have any of those underlying philosophical objections to certain uses of power, as you said. He'd be more willing to take down political opponents and to go in really objectionable directions when it comes to surveillance and things like that. But honestly, since Trump, I don't believe he's especially philosophically orientated. His narcissism is more rooted in this vain need to be talked about, and it's more centered on attention. As long as he's the center of attention, I feel he's satisfied. When it comes to substantive policy, I don't think he's that interested in it. I think he would delegate that to other people in his cabinet. So when he may rhetorically gesture in one direction or another on a certain issue, but I don't think he's interested enough to really follow through. So it's not so much power that I think he's after as it is attention.
Okay, I can hear most of our audience's mind just cracking at that point, whereas a Marxist would sort of that sees more of the guy not being as sinister as the capitalist.
That's just what I've observed so far in his case. I could be wrong.
You could be right as well, yeah.
Well, yeah, that's all I really I mean, time will tell if he should get in office, and well, obviously all of us will be following closely what he does. But I think he's more superficial than that.
Well, hopefully so, because
Yeah.
the way I see it, that then is that somebody's going to say, well, I want to leave a mark for when I die, and I want to make sure my name is like supreme, like I've created almost the new American royal family. Now, that's like the biggest egotistical man ever. But if he,
Mhm.
if so happens that he does some good things in the process of fulfilling his ego,
Mhm.
well, is that a bad thing? I don't know. But
Yeah, not necessarily.
but then I say that there's a little bit of a slippery slope here, because even though this man may come in with these good egotistical intentions, that's all well and good. But when
Mhm.
things start to turn a little bit sour, that's when I don't know. I think that's where the power situation and bad news starts to create a bit of a toxic mess, really, after a while.
Absolutely. And just to clarify, even if my assessment is right and Trump isn't that interested in power as such, that doesn't mean that things can't get significantly worse. To the extent he delegates those policy proposals to other individuals in his cabinet, they can be just as authoritarian and really invasive as anyone else. So things could get worse, even if he's not personally behind some of these decisions. So I should qualify what I say uh, in terms of that,
Yeah.
because I don't mean to give the impression that if he's elected, then yeah, we'll have a reversal in terms of the police state and our civil liberties being eroded or anything like that. It could get worse.
Yeah. Well, I mean, I guess you take a bit of a twang from an anarchist position as well as I do, but there's two little things in which I go to myself, hey, well, maybe that did work. And the major one that I continuously struggle with sometimes is like smoking bans. Now, smoking is pretty much on the drop pretty much everywhere you're going now, and it's been literally enforced. So especially over in Australia, you get like pictures of like diseased lungs, and you can't smoke in certain zones, and they banned it in pubs and clubs and everywhere else. So it's literally that force actually created a good after a while. It wasn't necessarily like a complicit thing. Maybe it was voted for by the Senate, like whoever was in power, the politicians, but it was like obviously some people definitely objected to being not allowed to smoke in public areas and things like that.
Mm-hmm.
Now, there's another point in which Donald Trump will say, well, I want to start stop and frisk because that does actually work. Now, it encroaches on civil liberties, and you're probably going to get a bit more penalised. So if you look like a geek, you're not going to probably be stopped and frisked. But if you looked a little bit more aggressive and you got a little bit of a swagger when you walk, then you're going to be picked on a bit more. So I don't know. I guess the point I'm trying to get to here is, do you think that there is a society that can start setting down pretty draconian positions and actually be a force for good?
Um, I think that it can yield positive results when it comes to the example of smoking. There, as you said, there has been a precipitous decline in use of tobacco. Part of that has to do just with the revelations that it does indeed cause cancer. So that scared a lot of people. But also the bans, the public smoking bans, that clearly had an effect as well. I take a slightly different approach than certain, especially anarchists, on the question, just because I think when we had initially discussed self management a few episodes back, I had made the point that um, anytime you're engaged in an activity that affects others, such as public smoking, then it's reasonable for other people to have a say as to whether or not they want to be subjected to the consequences of your specific decision. Smoking is a good example. And if you live in a country where you have a national health service and everyone is contributing to your health care, at the very least, they should be able to regulate whether or not they're exposed to your smoking and whether or not to tax that article of consumption, because that the revenue that they get can go into the public health service and cover whatever additional expenses your tobacco use has on the system. So that's legitimate. Now, if you lived in a strictly private property market economy where everyone is covering their own needs, then everyone's paying for their own health care. I think smoking within that context is different because you're paying for your own medical costs. So if you should decide to incur whatever health effects obtain from smoking, you're paying for it. You're not expecting other people to cover it for you. So that's sort of where I stand on the question. I'm not one to like elite social engineering. I treat that with contempt when it's just imposed on us as opposed to democratically consented to.
Yeah.
But I do agree that it can be a force for good. So stop and frisk. My only objection with that is that it's more, you're treating the symptom and not the cause. So it may serve to reduce gun crime and things of that nature, but you're really not getting to the source of what causes that in the first place. You're just minimizing the fallout from it.
Yeah, just to add on to that, because there's a lot of things that come from your side that does it sounds very anarchist. So is there a lot of connections between Marxism and Anarchism?
Yeah, there are. Historically, substantively, there's a lot of overlap. Marx himself was by no means a statist, but I think where anarchists and Marxists differ is in how we define the state and also how we conceive of going about abolishing it. So the Marxist definition of a state is basically the institutional representation of class oppression. So so long as you have different economic classes, you need a state apparatus to enforce the will of the dominant class. We don't view the state as administrative entities. We view it as institutions of class oppression. So take a good example would be the judicial system and enforcement of private property. All of those are reflective of the state. We wouldn't regard, say, the Department of Motor Vehicles as intrinsically a statist institution. We view it as an administrative governance body. So we make that, whereas anarchists of any persuasion tend to view any bureaucratic or administrative entity as an extension of a state. That's where we really differ. But when it comes to just hierarchy and those sort of and then paternalism and authoritarianism, Marxists and anarchists have a lot of overlap. It's really just a matter of how we categorize things that makes the main distinction.
Have you ever looked into the Spanish Civil War that much?
Oh yeah, my great grandfather was
I had a feeling that was going to be the case.
Man. Yeah, he was involved in the anarchist workers militias.
Oh, there you go. Okay,
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. So it's ingrained in the family to an extent.
Oh yeah, he got imprisoned by Francisco Franco's forces during the war. He escaped prison and had to flee to southern France afterwards. And then that was sort of the impetus behind my family coming to the United States. After that, because the fascists won the war.
Yeah.
My family was sort of blacklisted, and we needed to get out of there. So yeah, I've studied it a lot after that when I learned our family history.
So, yeah, I think we're probably going to go down to a history route, but yeah, this is good anyway. But like the way because I watched a documentary the other day just specifically on that, and it's so focusing around I think a Scottish, I think she may have been a Marxist potentially, a lady who went over there and she was part of the movement for the anarchism. I think she was an anarchist, maybe. Could be wrong, but yeah. But then there's a lot of connection between the Marxists, the Russians, for example, and the actual anarchist movement inside Spain as well. And then you can correct me at this point because I'm probably just like murdering the history here. And then you had the Franco regime and that's the fascist regime, isn't it? And basically, I'm interested in terms of like the one thing that I was interested with this, it was like this lady's perspective of what was going on and stuff like that, is that the community was working in a sense. The anarchism was actually working in that community as even during war times and stuff like that. And there was even military women who were who were fighting. And I don't know, have you got any I don't know, personal anecdotes that got passed through the family or anything like that, or just in particular just an idea of how the anarchism was structured and whether it worked, or was there problems with it or anything like that?
Oh yeah. Well, from what I know, just through family anecdotes and from the history that I've studied on the subject, I think on the order of 10 million plus Spaniards were involved in production in anarchist occupied parts of the peninsula. So the main area of anarchist influence before and during the Civil War was in Catalonia and in Andalusia in southern Spain. In Catalonia, which is a region where you have Barcelona and other major cities of Spain, that's where you had more of the industrial areas. So you had workers' control of factories and shops and what have you in those regions. And then as you went south into Andalusia, that's where you had a lot of the agrarian agricultural collectives. From what I've read and heard, all of the, I don't know if it's all of them, but the empirical literature demonstrates that production was on the rise, efficiency increased, everything was working fairly well in terms of the economic performance. Now, the military performance was another matter. The anarchist militias were very decentralized, and they didn't have conventional ranks or
they couldn't think of an overall strategy. It was a bit more
right.
Much more difficult.
Every decision was subject to deliberation, and I like that idea in principle, but when you're in the midst of a war, those sort of time is of the essence. So the more you debate and discuss any particular issue, the more time you're providing the enemy to make encroachments and undermine your position. And then there was a lot of infighting between the anarchists and the Stalinists in the war. There's a really good book, probably the best book on the Spanish Civil War I've ever read was George Orwell's account of the war, because he was a volunteer. Yes. It's called Homage to Catalunya. And he goes over a lot of the infighting that existed in Spain. The Soviet Union had sort of half-heartedly supported the Republic in the war, and the Nazis and Italian fascists supported Franco. And there was a lot of dissension between the communist organizations that were beholden to Moscow and the anarchists who were more native, and they cared more about the social revolution that had occurred, whereas Stalin was engaged in a lot of geopolitical maneuvering, and he didn't want to alienate his capitalist allies at the time in France and England. So he was more interested in reestablishing more of a liberal bourgeois republic so as to not alienate the aforementioned allies he had, whereas the anarchists were really pushing for that social revolution. It's a really complicated history, and it's a sad outcome.
Yeah, just like I remember the very first time I ever heard about it. It was a very weird thing because basically I was talking to my cousins and stuff like that, and I was looking at pictures, and basically I was pointed to just like an old guy there and stuff like that, and it says, "Oh yeah, he's well known as a nutcase," basically. I said, "All right, okay. What was it? What was his story?" He goes, "Well, after the Second World War finished, because he was such a war hungry, like I don't know, he must have had a lust for blood or anything like that. He went straight fighting in for Franco straight after that. So." Wasn't that right? Because the Second World War finished and then that war was still going on. Am I wrong? Or have I got the history
Well,
lines right? Something
what
like that. But
happened?
he continued into that war. So I thought,
Mhm.
like, so to get thrown into the mix, you get all these nutcase veterans that get thrown into that war afterwards on top of it.
Right. Well, what happened was the Civil War completed before the Second World War finished, but there was still ongoing skirmishes in Spain between, anti-fascist resistant groups and the new fascist authority. So there was still definitely some skirmishes happening after the Second World War and the Spanish Civil War had come to a conclusion. So that may account for that.
Okay.
But on the timeline, I think the Civil War had come to an end by 1939, if my memory is correct. Whereas the Second World War ended in 45. But
Okay. Yeah.
again, there was still a lot of resistance in the country to the new fascist authority, especially in places like Catalonia and the Basque Country.
Yeah, 'cause I don't know why, but that I remember. So, you know, when you memorize things as a kid, I always remember that like that story. I just that's a person that
Mhm.
was so war hungry that just
Oh
and
yeah.
went from one war to another war. It's like, what the hell is that person all about? Like, he must have had such a wrecked past that he's just continuously fighting in battles for the rest of his life. But yeah, very yeah, it's just an interesting subject, and yeah, and you threw in Orwell as well, which is Orwell's always fascinated me anyway. Just the fact that he's like the kind of person that I would love to emulate to a certain degree because he's just like the realms of telling stories and trying to resonate people about the things of power and how corruption happens, and he's a fascinating character for our history, and I guess he's got a lot of connections as well. If you want to go down the conspiracy theory path as well, with certain elites and higher societies as well. So it always patches together. All of these little stories always patch together in very strange and peculiar ways that you never quite. It'll be so fascinating one day that we actually get the full picture, but you're never going to find that out, unfortunately.
Yeah, unfortunately.
Okay, so I think what we'll do just to quickly move on because there are other things as well, which I think I would just need a couple of other details on from you as well. Is that I've got this feeling, and I could be totally wrong, but I feel like we're getting a little bit closer to this economic reset collapse situation. And what would your position be?
Well, I feel that, and again, I think that this election cycle is sort of obscuring all the other stories that are happening right now.
Yeah,
I haven't seen any signs of improvement economically speaking. I've also been monitoring quarterly profit returns in the United States and Western Europe, there hasn't seemed to have been any resurgence in the rate of profit being recorded by the major corporations. So, with that in mind, it's clear to me that another recession slash depression is on the horizon. It's really just a matter of time. They say that unemployment rates have dropped in the United States, but you always have to take the official record skeptically because they're not taking into account long-term unemployment. They don't even acknowledge those people in the statistics.
Yeah. Well,
So,
from my position, I'm seeing news articles which are coming out from some fairly well established corporations. Say, for example, I saw the other day Goldman Sachs made an announcement to say, well, commodities and especially iron ore is looking pretty bearish because of the overbuild in China. There's a massive load of ghost cities. They're actually alluding to a lot of the problems which we knew already, but it's becoming very mainstream, particularly from these big financial institutions. HSBC actually recently, I think even today, said that everything's leading to a very sizable crash in the US stock markets right now. So when you get these very big, well-established companies saying this kind of information, and really they should be like real estate agents talking about the housing market, they should be saying everything's fantastic, buy, buy, buy. But when they themselves are starting to do this thing, wouldn't that highlight to you a warning sign?
oh yeah, it's always cause for alarm when you have major financial institutions issuing these sort of warnings because it's certainly not in their interest to do so. And yeah, that is definitely troubling.
Yeah. Yeah, it's just I really I've got this feeling that the props get put up just before the elections, and maybe to get the established candidate Hillary Clinton that's got all the lobbyists who are backing to power. But as soon as that power comes into play, then they've really pushed everything they can into propping up the economy. Interest rates are at the lowest possible. Like there's literally no gunpowder left in terms of actually holding it up any further. That you could see that you might have, well, we know on the from the Austrian sort of perspective, there's the credit bubbles in pretty much every asset class market. It's hitting every single one. Now, one of the interesting ones I found recently, actually through discussing with I've got this another person I've been speaking to recently. He's a day trader. He studies the markets and things like that as well. His name's Francis Hunt, and he's alluding now. He's very conspiratorial as well. That there's a massive influx of money which is going into military spending now.
Mm-hmm.
So you can see that obviously these credit bubbles are forming. They're potentially on the precipice of collapsing, but then a lot of the money whereby, say recently it was a commodities boom, that's getting depressed now. All the like your iron ore, I know oil's gone up a little bit, but not so much. But a lot of money is going into the military spending. So Lockheed Martin has tripled in 3 years, which is a significant change on a stock valuation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
And what does that tell you?
Yeah, anytime you see those sort of influxes of money into the military-industrial complex, as it were, it's always an ominous sign. I hope that this isn't in anticipation of further military ventures, but I mean that's definitely something you could deduce from that information. And also, I know that last time we spoke, we were discussing how pivotal military spending is for a certain segment of the economy, especially in the United States. There's just so many communities and families that are dependent upon this this sector of our economy,
Yeah.
I can see how those sort of transfers of investment funds can actually be register positively in terms of people's conception of our economic performance and well-being, especially in an election cycle. If they were to, withdraw those funds or just keep them as they are, I think you'd have a different sense of where people conceive of our well-being before, and that can cause issues for the establishment party. So it's really difficult to determine whether or not this is a sign of things to come geopolitically, or if it's just a matter of pure Machiavellian political strategizing. But in any event, I think the underlying economic conditions have not improved. Protestations from the Democratic Party notwithstanding, as I said, even if unemployment is technically down, which I have reservations about, if you look at the sort of jobs people are having to get, they're qualitatively worse than what they had 10 years ago. People are lowering their expectations and making do with less. And that's not a sign of a healthy economy.
So I just want to put a theory out to you here. So with Marx's theory, you can correct me at any stage if I get this wrong, but there's a certain position where things come to an inevitable crash. Am I right in thinking that? Yep. So this is like a counter theory that I'm getting played out a lot of times, that maybe there's a ruling elite, for example, and they've got a lot of cash, and they can pick and choose where the credit bubbles are, where the crashes are as well. So maybe it was housing market, maybe it was the commodities boom, maybe now it's the military boom, and you can see that maybe this has gone throughout history, the war spending in the past, things like that. Now, how does that conflict with Marx's theory? Or would the Marxist theory say that eventually even those elites are going to get wiped out at some point?
I think what sort of distinguishes Marxist crisis theory from most other accounts is that Marxism conceives of crisis happening endogenously in the system, and specifically in the system of production, not in finance, not in distribution, but in production itself. So Austrian crisis theory is exogenous. So they believe that macro instability is purely a result of government policy, and specifically in the money markets, where you have Federal Reserve having artificially low interest rates, and that causes malinvestment, et cetera, et cetera. Neoclassical economists believe it's exogenous as well, because they have their theory of equilibrium. So they're always looking for sources of instability from the state as well.
Yeah.
They just differ with the Austrians as to where it specifically lies.
Yeah.
And then the Keynesians, they have their own theory of animal spirits, and
they think there's a little bit of manipulating they can do to stabilize the market. They believe in government spending to prop up production sometimes. Do.
Yeah, they have like a top-down idea of how you can. I feel that if you read Keynes personally, he seems sort of agnostic as to where he thinks the source of instability lies, but he's optimistic about the state's role in managing out of a crisis. Whereas the other schools of economic thought are more skeptical about the government's role therein. But Marxist theory has to do with long-term decline in the rate of profit. And that, again, that goes back to the labor theory of value itself. and it has to do with the ratio of variable to constant capital. It's a really a long process explanation. But
So Marxist theory will eventually destroy the mechanisms of production that even
right, well,
the Rothschilds or the Rockefellers can't even avoid it.
yeah, I should clarify. We wouldn't say that the government has no role as to where these bubbles emerge, whether it's in the property markets or finance or military expenditures. We're perfectly willing to entertain the notion that the government plays a role in where the bubbles end up emerging. Where we disagree as to what precipitates those bubbles in the first place. We think that you start seeing these speculative bonanzas as a consequence of rates of profit declining in the productive sector. So your rate of return as an investor um, eventually is more attractive in more speculative realms because it's harder to turn a profit in regular production of commodities, goods and services.
Yeah.
So that's where we're drawing the distinction.
Excellent. Thank you, Michael.